So you want to come this way. welcome. Hello. I love the energy. I think we're all going to have a wonderful night, and it sounds like a whole lot of you have already been having a great start to it, so fabulous. Good evening and welcome to Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. I'm Audra Kelly, Director of Interpretation or our Education Programming here at Hillwood, and I'd like to share a special welcome for those of us who are joining us not in this room but over in simulcast. My first order of business is to let you know that the person who's usually here at the podium, our Executive Director, Kate Markert, is in Palm Beach and is very sorry to be missing everyone. And our esteemed speaker this evening, and that really is true. That really is true. While I know many of you are already Hillwood members, I would like to encourage all of you who are not to join us. Hillwood members are so valued to the support to all that we do, our exhibitions, programs like tonight, and our scholarship, and we thank you all for that support. Continuing to channel Kate, for those of you who've been to a lecture before, you now know that we're about a minute in, so I'll be saying, can you please take a moment to double check all your devices and see that they are silenced? And thank you so much in advance for taking care of that business. I hope that everyone has had a chance tonight to go to the Dacha tonight or will soon to explore the newly opened exhibition, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems. And of course, we will be exploring the cultural history of decorative stones in this space with a lecture series that begins in about a month on March 24th, if that is something that's interesting to you. Also looking ahead to the next month, the greenhouse bustles in March with the largest variety of orchids that are in bloom at that moment. And of course, the display in the greenhouse, it really is stunning. And we hope that you spread the word for us about all the dozens, truly dozens, of greenhouse tours throughout the month and a variety of hands-on workshops if you want to get your hands sort of down and dirty in the dirt with orchids. And there's lots more information about all of our upcoming programs and activities on our website, and even an email that will be going out if you've signed up for that pretty soon. So let's turn our focus to tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Author and journalist Lelia Bundles is an engaging public speaker and skilled MC who brings warmth, intelligence, humor, and a strong grasp of current events and history to her presentations. After a 30-year career as an executive and Emmy award-winning producer with ABC News and NBC News, she is now brand historian for Madam C.J. Walker Beauty Culture, a line of hair care products created by Sundial Brands. She is a trustee of Columbia University and immediate past chairman of the National Archives Foundation. Lelia Bundles speaks at conferences, colleges, corporations, and other venues about entrepreneurship, philanthropy, financial literacy, women's history, and African American history. And she writes biographies about the amazing women in her family: entrepreneur Madam C.J. Walker and Harlem Renaissance icon Lelia Walker. The New York Times described her book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, as well-paced and well-written, as much social history as biography, filled with the detail and texture of culture and politics. Netflix has adapted her publication for a mini-series titled Self-Made, inspired by the life of Madam C.J. Walker. Produced by LeBron James, the series stars the incredible, at least on my opinion, Oscar-winning Octavia Spencer as Walker. Yes, yes. It debuts March 20th. Mark all of our calendars, right? On Her Own Ground is available in the museum shop upstairs, and our speaker will be delighted to sign copies at the desk just outside this theater at the end of tonight's lecture. So, please join me in welcoming Lelia Bundles.
I had to have a little step. I think this is the Donna Shalala honorary step. Me and Donna. And Madeline Albright, there are a whole bunch of us who are really tall in spirit and in intellect. As some of us say, we measure it from the head, the neck up. I will just say that. That's right, vertically challenged. But I'm just so delighted to be here, and I actually am kind of embarrassed to say I've never been to Hillwood. I know. But see, that means I haven't had enough fun. It means I've been working too hard, and my goal for 2021, after I get through all of the excitement that goes along with this Netflix series, which is a very Hollywood version, so you must read the book. And then I'm writing a book about Madam Walker's daughter, Lelia Walker. So I've written 4 books about Madam Walker, and I'm going to tell you stories about them. But her daughter, Lelia Walker, my namesake, is a real key figure, central figure of the Harlem Renaissance, and there's never been a biography written about her. And so I think as we are in the home of Marjorie Post, that daughters of self-made wealthy people and then their daughters sometimes have a hard time carving out their own identities. So this is my attempt to talk about Lelia Walker in the new book, which is called The Joy Goddess of Harlem, because Langston Hughes, the poet, was a friend of hers and called her the Joy Goddess of Harlem's 1920s. So she has a really interesting life. She's kind of been pigeonholed into her mother made the money, she spent the money, which is a really easy, cliched way to go about telling her story, but she's, of course, much more interesting. Nobody is that two-dimensional. But it's just my pleasure to be here, and I really look forward to coming back. I had a wonderful tour, just kind of like little bits and pieces, and now I want to come back, and I'm going to come back and see if I can learn how to do orchids, because I kill every lovely orchid that anybody has ever given me. Actually, Erin, thank you very much. Erin has been so kind. I don't know how many months we've been talking to get me here, and so I'm really pleased. But I actually have been moving so fast. I was on a train from New York this morning because we did a screening of the Netflix series last night with some critics, and I'm going back to New York tomorrow morning. And Erin, I can't remember how much time I have and how much time I need to leave for Q&A, so tell me. It says 6:38 here. What time do I need to be?
We are scheduled to wrap up around 7:30.
Okay, so by 7:15 I should be doing Q&A, because Q&A is my favorite thing. Anyway, I'm really very informal. And I have about 70 slides, so some of them we're going to go through really fast, but I was on a Acela this morning, and I'm like, I think they would like to see this. And so that's how so I'm doing some improvisation. But for those of you who don't know about Madam C.J. Walker, she was an amazing African-American entrepreneur, and born in Delta, Louisiana in 1867. On the same plantation where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. In fact, I think I will just go to that picture first. So in this cabin, she was a great marketer, because on a trip in 1916, she went to visit that plantation and had a photographer take the photo, and she used it in her lectures. She had what was called a stereopticon, which was the PowerPoint of her day. And she, in a time before television and movies, there were some silent movies, but she would do lectures, and that would draw crowds to see her, but she included this. But born on this plantation in 1867, the first child in her family born free. By the time she was 7 years old, both of her parents had died. She had to move in with an older sister, Lavinia, and Lavinia's husband, Sarah Breedlove, which her birth name, later said, was so cruel that she got married at 14 to get a home of her own, married a man named Moses McWilliams. They had a daughter named Lelia, my namesake, who later changed her name to Lelia. And when Sarah was 20, Moses died. We don't know exactly how, but she was left a widow, as she said, and she knew she wasn't moving back in with her sister in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was right across the river from Delta. But she moved up the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where her older brothers had moved in the early 1880s. Their family minister had been a shop owner, and he had been elected a state senator during Reconstruction. And he was chased out of the state by the Ku Klux Klan because he was advocating for the rights of the sharecroppers in an area that was 90% black, because it had been a very wealthy cotton producing area. So after the Civil War, the 90% of the population was able to elect officials who represented them, but in the election of 1876, the backlash was so great that they were all pushed out of office, and he was chased out of the state at gunpoint. Her brothers had followed him to St. Louis. And when poor Sarah Breedlove, uneducated person who had done housework and who had worked in the fields, arrived in St. Louis, her brother's barber shop was very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. And if you know anything about the history of the AME Church, you know that even during slavery, the leadership of the church often was very educated, and they made it their mission to educate African Americans, and they also had a very international outlook with missionaries in Africa. So it was the women of the church of St. Paul AME who began to give Sarah Breedlove a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. The school teachers, the social workers, the more middle-class women of the church who were part of the club women's movement, women who were very involved in suffrage during the late 19th century, early 20th century. These women took her under their wing, made sure that her daughter was going to school. She joined the choir. She had a good enough voice, and so she was aspiring to do something better with her life. So I'm just going to go back here. So this is the picture that is sort of the most iconic photograph of Madam Walker that appeared on a 1998 stamp. So Sarah Breedlove is in St. Louis, and she is trying to better her life. And I'm going to tell you something, like, this is the first convention, 1917, her first convention of her sales agents. So she goes from a washerwoman to a woman who now is leading a company within the span of about a decade. 1905, she is selling products for a woman named Annie Malone, who later becomes her fiercest competitor. But they have a falling out. Sarah decides to go on her own, moves from St. Louis to Denver, where she has a sister-in-law, widowed sister-in-law, and 4 nieces. She's been able to send her daughter to Knoxville College to pay that $7.85 tuition in 1901. She goes to Denver, immediately, of course, joins the shorter AME church, because that's a good network for her. And her good friend, Charles Joseph Walker, who sells newspaper ads and who knows something about marketing, joins her, moves from St. Louis to Denver. They get married. She starts her own company, the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, marketing her wonderful hair grower. And she builds this company into a very successful business, and she trains other women. So in 1917, she has her first convention of the Walker sales agents. And she is here. Let's see, there we go. There's Madam Walker. This is a different kind of pointer, but it's very interesting. So that's Madam Walker. I like that. It's very interesting. I'm glad. Erin, thank you for giving me the lesson on this. So she's here with these women who've come from all over the United States. They are former washerwomen, former maids, former sharecroppers, some school teachers, because they actually could make more money selling Walker's products at school than they could as school teachers. And at the convention in 1917, 2 years before Mary Kay is born, she gives prizes to the women who sell the most products and who bring in the most new sales agents. But she also gives prizes to the women who contribute the most to charity. And during her keynote, she says to them, I want you to know that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. because during that summer, the riot in East St. Louis had happened when a few dozen African Americans essentially were slaughtered in their homes and pulled off of trolley cars. So Madam Walker was very conscious of lynching and what was going on, and was very supportive of this legislation. Woodrow Wilson, those of you who know your history about Woodrow Wilson knew that he didn't really care. But she was very adamant about that, and in fact, after the silent protest parade in New York, where 10,000 African Americans either marched or stood on the side on Fifth Avenue in silence, marching up the avenue with banners that were sort of urging this legislation, Madam Walker and a number of Harlem leaders took the train from New York to Washington to meet with Woodrow Wilson. They thought they had an appointment. When they arrived, his secretary, his chief of staff, Joseph Tumulty, told them that he was too busy working on a feed bill. So he did not meet with them, but they went up to Capitol Hill. So she, in my mind, was kind of Black Lives Matter 1.0, that she really was already very conscious of that. But at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to him. So Madam Walker made her money, and the Guinness Book of World Records lists her as the first self-made American woman millionaire. Now, this is, for me, there are a lot of people who really care about this designation. And a friend of mine who's a scholar calls this the first millionaire sweepstakes. And so it's not really the most important thing to me, but it does matter to other people. What matters to me is the wealth that she helped create, the intergenerational wealth she helped create for African American families, the jobs she provided, her philanthropy to schools and colleges and organizations that made her community better. So there are a whole lot of, that she was a patron of the arts, so there are a whole lot of other things that matter a lot more to me, but that millionaire thing matters to a lot of people. But her wealth was created because she was solving her own problem. And 100 years ago, when most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing, hygiene was very different. We take for granted that we can jump in the shower every morning and wash our hair and take a shower, and that we can go to the corner drugstore and there are hundreds of different options for hair care products. But at that point, that wasn't the case. And so Sarah Breedlove, like millions of other women, was going bald because she had really horrible scalp infections. And so if you imagine whatever dandruff you've ever had and multiply that by 1,000 times, that was what she was experiencing. So she was losing her hair. And she was also battling the European standards of beauty, that African American women were told that they weren't beautiful and that they couldn't compete. And so the standard of beauty was the Gibson girl, which I think most white women couldn't really even be. Those wasp waists were not most people. But then you just pile on that what the standard of beauty is, all of the images that are there. And she said, I was so ashamed of my frightful appearance that I prayed to the Lord for a solution. And one night in a dream, a big African man appeared and told me what to mix up for my formula. And some of the ingredients came from Africa. I sent for them, I mixed them together, and my hair began to grow back faster than it had ever fallen out. So I heard a few snickers, and I have to say that I think that is part of the truth. I don't doubt that she had a dream. Even Einstein said that part of the theory of relativity came to him in a revelation and in a dream. But it is also true that this formula, this secret formula and system of hers, really was a centuries-old remedy, and it was wash your hair more often, pretty basic, and apply an ointment that contains sulfur. And sulfur was the medicinal agent. And so once she did that, her scalp was healthy, her hair began to grow back. So Cuticura is kind of that same, that's a product that we could, we all remember that was very similar. But in fact, now people wanted to know what she was using, and they were interested in buying her product. So in Denver, she was selling her product. She put her own image on the product, which was really pretty revolutionary for a black woman to say, I'm making a statement that I'm beautiful, and that other people who buy the product can also feel beautiful. And she began to travel around. She married Charles Joseph Walker in Denver. They began to travel, because Colorado didn't have a lot of black residents, and that meant her market was going to be pretty limited. And so she began to travel throughout Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Mississippi, the Southwest and the South, where there were larger black populations. And she began training women. These are some women actually in Ohio. But they would go to the Baptist church and the Methodist church. They go to the Oddfellows Lodge and the Knights of Pythias Lodge, wherever there was a place where they could have a lecture. And then after the lecture with her, early on she didn't have the stereopticon, but it was a lecture of the things she had seen and what was going on, current events with African Americans. But she would have a meeting later with a group of maybe 10 to 15 women who were interested in bettering themselves and in having their own business. And she would demonstrate her hair care system, talk to them, and she could always identify who asked the best questions, who was the most curious, who did others gravitate towards. And that's the person she would make her lead agent in the city. So she was very adept at identifying leaders. And these women became her sales agents. She trained thousands of women throughout the United States. In 1908, she moved to Pittsburgh and started Lelia College, a beauty culture named after her daughter. She stayed in Pittsburgh for about a year and a half, but Pittsburgh didn't have all of the elements that she needed to develop her business. And Indianapolis, where I grew up, and you may say, Indianapolis, why Indianapolis in 1910? But Indianapolis at that point was near the center of population for America. It was called the Crossroads of America because of all the trains that went through the city. It was one of the only sort of capitals that didn't have a river, but it had trains. And so for somebody who was developing a mail order business, it was a really excellent location. It also had a very thriving black business community, and though it had a smaller population numerically of African Americans, the percentage of African Americans was about 9%. So that was larger than any other northern city. And in the city, there was a strip of a commercial district, and there were 3 weekly black newspapers, including the Indianapolis Freeman, which was kind of like a Black USA Today, with a section that had current events, and then an entertainment section, and a sports section. And Madam Walker took out ads in that newspaper, so the Pullman porters who were coming through Indianapolis on the trains would pick up stacks of the paper and sell them if they were going to Detroit or Atlanta or Boston or San Francisco. So Madam Walker's ads were being seen. So I just know she would have been an Instagram girl, but she didn't have Instagram, so she was using the newspapers, and she would take out ads using that before and after picture that you saw with the 3 photos. And she used testimonial letters, and women had written to her. And one woman, for instance, had said, before I started using Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower, my hair was 1/8 of an inch long. And now my hair is down my back, and I have been able to throw my wig away. So it really did work. She said, if you're going to be successful, first you have to have a product that really works, and then you have to advertise. And then it was not only about aesthetics, it was not only about beauty, it was not only about how you looked, it was also about economic independence. So she also included letters from women who were her agents. And another woman wrote to her and said, you have made it possible for a black woman to make more money in a day selling your products than she could in a month working in somebody's kitchen. So she was really helping women become economically independent. And when they came to her conventions, they told her how they'd been able to buy homes and educate their children and then invest in real estate and start other businesses. So she was really an economic engine for women's economic independence. These are some of her employees. She had a real knack for surrounding herself with very competent people. Her attorney, F.B. Ransom, who is, there's F.B. Ransom right there, had been a Pullman porter. She hired him, and he was the person who allowed her to be on the road all the time because he crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's and made sure she wasn't in legal jeopardy, where her major competitor had a lot of lawsuits and no really good lawyer. So she was very good about her C-suite. She knew how to create that. Shortly after she moved to Indianapolis, there was a big campaign to build a YMCA in the black community. There was a new building for the white YMCA because the YMCAs were segregated at that point. And the white YMCA was a $250,000 building in 1910, and it had state-of-the-art everything and a swimming pool. And the black YMCA was just a raggedy old building with not enough meeting rooms, and the basketball floor in Indiana, which you know Indiana's a big basketball state, the floor was under regulation size, and that meant the boys had to reduce the number of players from 5 to 3 to fit on the table, to fit on the floor. So clearly they needed a new building. And Jesse Moreland, if you know Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard, Jesse Moreland was the first black secretary of the YMCA, and he had persuaded Julius Rosenwald, the head of, some of you have seen my friend Aviva Kempner's film, Rosenwald, persuaded Julius Rosenwald to pledge $25,000 to any city in America where the black and white communities would work together to raise the balance of $75,000 to build a building. So Madam Walker attended that first rally that Jesse Moreland had in Indianapolis with the leadership of the white YMCA, the leadership of the black YMCA, and the white businessmen pledged $1,000, $5,000, $10,000. And then to everyone's surprise and shock, Madam Walker stood up and said, I pledge $1,000 to the building fund of the YMCA because I believe if I help our boys, it will help our girls. And that is what I am interested in. She knew the boys needed help, but nothing was being done for the girls. So people were stunned. And so now, as she traveled around, they wanted to hear not just about her hair care products, but about her philanthropy and about the difference she was trying to make in the community and in the country. And so she decided that she wanted to go to Booker T. Washington. You see Booker T. Washington right there next to her. So Booker T. Washington had founded the National Negro Business League, and at his 1912 convention, Madam Walker arrived in her chauffeur-driven car. She had met Booker T. Washington before, and he had kind of rebuffed her. But she decided now people were reading about her in these black newspapers all over the country and some white newspapers, and she thought that she had an amazing story to tell, how she had started on a plantation, been a washerwoman, now was very prosperous. And so she arrived at the convention and sent word to Booker T. Washington that she wished to be a speaker. She had not been invited beforehand, but she thought, who has a better story than I do? As Madeleine Albright said, sometimes you have to interrupt, and that was where she was coming from. But he ignored her request. And on the second day of the convention, her good friend George Knox, who was who's the publisher of the Indianapolis Freeman, the paper that she advertised in, stood up and he said, we should hear from Madam C.J. Walker. She is the woman from my hometown of Indianapolis who contributed $1,000 to the building fund of the YMCA, and she has an incredible story to tell. And even though Mr. Knox was on Booker T. Washington's advisory board and they knew each other well and he was successful, Booker T. Washington kind of brushed him aside. And he said, we're discussing lifetime membership. And then he called upon somebody in the audience who was not discussing lifetime membership. In fact, to add insult to injury, he called upon one of Madam Walker's neighbors, whose company was right down the street from hers. Mr. Saunders, H.L. Saunders, who in fact was very successful. He had a business that manufactured uniforms. He had worked as a bellman. His wife was a seamstress. They combined their talents and started making uniforms for people, and they had customers in Indiana and the 4 surrounding states. At this point, just a few years after Madam Walker started her business, she had customers all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. Mr. Saunders had been the treasurer of the campaign, the building fund campaign for the YMCA, and he had contributed $250. Very generous sum, but less than Madam Walker. Now, she was a good church-going woman, and I know that she knew you were not supposed to look in that collection basket as it went by and compare your gifts to others. However, I can't help but imagine that she felt at least a twinge of resentment. But she maintained her pride and dignity, and on the third and final day of the convention, she looked toward Booker T. Washington as the last banker was completing his remarks. And she stood at her seat and she said, "Surely you are not going to shut the door in my face. I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. From there, I was promoted to the washtub. From there, I was promoted to the kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself. I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations, and I have built my own factory on my own ground." The next year, he invited her back as a keynote speaker. So, and one of the first times I gave this talk, I told this story. One of Booker T. Washington's great-granddaughters happened to be in the audience, and I didn't know it. So I always am very careful to say, and by the time he died in 1915, there was a mutual respect between the two. Madam Walker visited his campus, and she had gained his respect, and she was friends with his wife, Margaret Murray Washington. But it's important for me to say that. Madam Walker was always ahead of her time. She's driving an electric car, a Waverly Electric, in 1913. She advertised heavily in the black press. And here she is with her daughter, Lelia, in their chauffeur-driven car. And Lelia was her inspiration for much of what she did. She wanted her daughter's life to be better, and you can tell she's the apple of her eye. And one of the things, there's so many stories that I can tell, and I see I have 8 minutes to do everything that I want to do before questions, but I'm going to get through. But that's why there's the book, and when the Lelia Walker book is written, I can come back and talk about her life because it's interesting too. But Lelia Walker, they were in Indianapolis. Lelia Walker was continuing to run the office in Pittsburgh after her mother and her stepfather moved to Indianapolis. But Pittsburgh was just not quite happening enough for her. And part of her territory was Harlem. And she persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem. So they bought this building on the left, 108 West 136th Street, in 1913. So African Americans were just starting to move from the Tenderloin and San Juan Hill in New York to Harlem. And there's a whole long story behind why that happened, and real estate busts and booms. But she bought this building and turned it into the Walker Salon and School. And then she hired Vertner Tandy, the first licensed black architect in New York, to transform the building and the building next door into this building that looks a lot like buildings on the east side in New York. And the downstairs was the beauty salon, and then their living quarters upstairs, and in the basement was the Walker Beauty School. So this is the salon. She wrote to her after it was designed by one of the top interior decorators in New York, and it was around the same time that Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein were starting. And she said that her designer told her this was as fancy as anything on Fifth Avenue. This is just another view. And a little Japanese tea room for the clients to wait. Oops. And then this is the beauty school. This is training. And I had this photo for many years, and I realized it's been a while, but after I'd had the photo for a while, this is Lelia Walker right here. And this is my grandmother, May, who has very long braids, and who Madam Walker's main product was Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. So May was actually adopted. I mean, that's a whole long story that I can't go into now, but Madam Walker and Lelia Walker had met her uncle when they lived in St. Louis, and when they moved to Indianapolis, his mother, May's grandmother, lived across the alley from the Walker factory. And May's father had died, and her mother was the third generation of women in her family to be in her 30s, widowed with 8 children. So May was somebody that Madam Walker and her daughter kind of took under their wing. She was an honor student, but the family couldn't afford to send her beyond 8th grade, and they legally adopted her and promised to educate her, and she went to Spelman and later became president of the company. But she's a whole Cinderella story that is in the new book. That's just the shampoo room. So Madam Walker continued to develop her business. She became very involved in politics and arts patronage, was really paying attention to what was going on during World War I and advocating for African American soldiers, but her health was failing. She had hypertension. She was starting to experience the early stages of kidney failure. And while the company remained headquartered in Indianapolis, her daughter persuaded her that she needed to move her residence to New York. And she was also feeling Indianapolis was, I love my hometown, but it was not the most progressive place in the world, especially for African Americans. And the NAACP was really on the rise, and she wanted to be where she could make an impact. So she moved to New York, and it became clear, and I sort of joke about this, but I think it's really true, that lovely big townhouse on 136th Street was too small for 2 women. So she needed her own mansion. So she hired Vertner Tandy again, and he designed this house, Villa Lewaro, for her in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County. Not too far from Jay Gould's home, Lyndhurst, and a few miles away from John D. Rockefeller's Kykuit. And it was the wealthiest, at that point, the wealthiest community in America. So where many of the millionaires and billionaires built their homes close to the Hudson, she built hers right on Broadway so that you could see it. She was really trying to make a statement. And Enrico Caruso, both women loved opera. And when I was, been doing my early research, I thought, well, maybe this is an affectation. They have money now, they go to the opera. But what I really discovered in my research is that in St. Louis, which was the birthplace of ragtime, for a point when they were very poor, they lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played. But their church, the AME church, is really sort of high church among black churches. And the church had a new building with a Kilgan organ, which was state-of-the-art. The choir director who was also the organist, was a classically trained tenor who sang opera. The children in the black schools Germans were head of the music departments for the overall St. Louis schools, and the African American musicians and principals, many of whom had gone to Oberlin, interacted with the German musicians, and the black children were learning German lieder, and they were learning opera, and they were seeing ragtime on the street. So the music fusion was something that they were experiencing. So they had a love of opera, and there were black opera singers. So Enrico Caruso was somebody with whom they became friendly, and he visited Villa Lewaro when it was being built, and was a friend of Lelia Walker's, and he said that the house reminded him of homes in Naples, where he had grown up, and he suggested they name it Villa Lewaro for Lelia Walker Robinson, who was her first husband. So it is still named that today, and it is still a National Historic Landmark. So this was just an early picture of the house, and this is the invitation for the opening party at Villa Lewaro. Madam Walker was very conscious of what was going on during World War I and what was happening to African American soldiers, and so she hosted a party for Emmett Scott, who had been Booker T. Washington's chief of staff at Tuskegee, but who now was the Undersecretary for Negro Affairs in the War Department. And she wanted to have a conference. She called this a conference of interest to the race, which of course made Emmett Scott very nervous because he was afraid of what Wilson would think about that, but she had already put it on the invitation, so it was too late. And these are just some pictures from the house. This resolution on this is not so great, but you can see, and as I was doing my tour, I could see some similarities on the friezes and in the house. This is a piano, and I think maybe later we'll see. So well, you can see the organ. So this Este organ was from a company in Vermont, And there's a whole story behind the company didn't want the neighbors to know that they were selling one of their organs to a black woman. So they kind of boxed it up and, and tried to hide it. But that's what was going on then. But it was piped all through the house. After Madam Walker died in May of 1919, Lelia became president of the company, and here's her attorney, Mr. Ransom, her other attorney, and then the employees of the company. And this was a big, scary thing for her, to be honest. And there's a whole nother story about the two boyfriends. Her mother wanted her to marry one. She told her mother that she was going to marry one on her deathbed. One was a good guy, one was a bad boy. You know where that story goes. So after her mother, and she told her she and my grandmother were traveling in Central America when her mother was on her deathbed, and she wrote a letter and said, "I'm going to marry Kennedy. I plan to marry Kennedy." Her mother said, "You can have your wedding here, then you can go to have a chateau in France." She summoned Kennedy to her bedside, said, "Make my daughter happy." And then when Lelia got back after her mother died, she married Wiley Wilson, the bad boy. He proceeded to act up. Then she later married Kennedy. So it's just like multiple marriages that I think that went on in this house. And so here she is in the music room, and then standing by the Neff in the music room. And so after her mother died, she's really trying to find her identity. And she loves culture, she loves music because they've steeped in it. That was kind of a real common bond between the two women. So this is a silent movie. There were a couple of silent movies that were shot at Villa Lewaro in the early 1920s. This is the garden in the back. In 1921, she hosted a 4th of July party for the Liberian president, C.D.B. King, who was in the United States attempting to get reimbursed for money that had been promised to him during World War I because of some things he had done for the United States government. He wasn't invited to the White House, but he was invited to Villa Lewaro. And this, I just put this in, this is the band. Ford Dabney's Syncopated Orchestra was hired to do the party. And it was on the terrace with fireworks over the Hudson because she never did anything halfway. This is a menu from Christmas dinner at Villa Lewaro. And while I know this is hard to find, but I have I'm from a family of pack rats, so I have all of these little, even the bills for the meat this is poultry, game, and meat specialties from one of New York's finest markets. So an aerial shot of the house in winter. And then Lelia Walker was quite an impresario. She knew how to entertain lavishly. So this is my grandmother, May. May doesn't look really happy, like, really? Can you see? This is her wedding. She's not a happy bride. So Lelia Walker, have mothers for a long time who think that they're marrying two clans of prosperous people, forced my grandmother to marry Dr. Henry Gordon Jackson, who was from a very prosperous black family. And he was a lot older than her, and she was not very happy about this, but it was a really fancy wedding with beautiful clothes. And here are the groomsmen. Here's the evil Dr. Henry Gordon Jackson. And all of these, everybody here, they're either lawyers, dentists, or doctors. This is yes, that's the husband. Isn't he like an evil-looking? He's not I can't tell you that my grandparents' marriage was made in heaven either, but it was better than this. So anyway, so they got married, and he was not a nice guy on many levels. But they had one child, my Uncle Walker, and then they were divorced pretty quickly. And then she came back to New York. My grandfather, who was from another very interesting black family, his father had been valedictorian of his class Lincoln, and his grandfather had been in elected office during Reconstruction. His mother had gone to Oberlin, so they're like, he thinks his family's pretty hot too. But he was at Columbia studying finance for the summer after having graduated from University of Pittsburgh Law School. And one of Lelia Walker's friends was also from his hometown of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He was an eligible bachelor who was driving a green Pierce Arrow, and he was invited to Villa Lewaro, and they met and they eloped. And then my mother was born a year later. So, and then this is the house. Lelia Walker had this big wedding in 1923, and she continued. She mainly lived in the city, but spent time on the weekends. People like Alberta Hunter, the blues singer, used to tell stories about visiting the house for the weekend. This is a 1924 convention of Walker agents. After 1917, they did a convention every year. And then here they are on the terrace, which it's just so dramatic to have all of these women lined up. And then this is Lelia Walker here, but I just put this in because these are, it's so rare to have candid shots during this period, but her friends would come up and have weekend parties. And just some other friends out on the back terrace. And so in the 1920s, Lelia Walker's house was, both the house in Irvington and the house in Harlem were places where all the writers and artists and musicians and actors would hang out, and the celebrities and European royalty and African royalty. Her place she was one of the few African Americans who really could afford to entertain. So her house she moved into a pied-à-terre on Edgecombe Avenue, those of you who know New York, sort of right on the edge of the park, because 136 and Lenox was becoming too commercial and too busy. So she started renting out rooms in the house for parties, for private parties. And in 1928, she created what was called the Dark Tower. This is the menu from the Dark Tower, Feast of the Muses. And it was something that some of the young writers said, we need a place where we can gather. But it was also at the time, the Cotton Club was very hot, and people from downtown were coming uptown, and it was becoming kind of a mishmash of things. But one of the things that I love on this menu is a Lelia Walker iced tea. Now, I don't know for sure, but it was Prohibition, so I'm guessing that you could put whatever you wanted in that. That's just my guess. And then Lelia Walker, the Depression hit, the company sales were going down. I think she, didn't want to be poor again, and as my grandfather said, she knocked herself out because she wanted to be knocked out. So she went to a party at a friend's house on Long Branch, New Jersey. After a day of champagne and chocolate cake and lobster, she had a stroke. She had hypertension like her mother and died. And her funeral was thousands of people who gathered for her funeral. Her body was taken to Woodlawn Cemetery. And there was a black pilot named Hubert Julian who flew over her grave just as he had flown over the grave of Florence Mills, where she was the blackbirds. He had dropped blackbirds over her grave site. He dropped gladiolas and dahlias, which were Lelia's favorite flowers, over the top of her grave as the mourners were there. So Langston Hughes wrote a poem about her that was read they called her Queen of the Night. So it's almost like the Diana Elton John thing. I mean, she was just that kind of person. So this is Villa Lewaro today, and just a couple of quick views of the house. These photos they were compressed, so they're not really showing you that. So I like to end with just some words from Madam Walker, and then we can talk about the house. But she said that people often asked her the secret to her success, and she would say to them, there is no royal, flower-strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it. For whatever success I have attained has been the result of much hard work and many sleepless nights. I got my start by giving myself a start. So don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. you have to get up and make them for yourself. Thank you. Okay, questions? So the house, I should do this as a little bit of a footnote.
Keep the questions for the folks at simulcast.
Oh, okay. So is the house open to the public? So the house is, and thank you for asking that because it gives me a perfect segue. So the house was sold by my grandparents and the Walker estate sold the house in 1932 or 3 to a group called the Companions of the Forest. It was a white women's benevolent organization, and they used it as kind of a refuge for some of their members, and they then turned it into kind of a retirement home. But the women started dying out in the 90s, and the house was sold to a man named Ingo Appel, who owned it until 1993. Then it was purchased by Harold and Helena Doley, who's an African-American investment banker, and they owned it until about 3 years ago, when Richelieu Dennis, who founded Sundial Brands and who manufactures the Madam C.J. Walker line of hair care products, created a foundation that purchased the house. So when Richelieu sold Sundial to Unilever, and though he's still involved with Sundial, he used some of the proceeds to buy Essence and Essence Fest, and to create a $100 million venture capital fund for women of color entrepreneurs called New Voices Fund. So Villa Lewaro, which is in amazing shape for a 100-year-old house because the Doleys did a lot of work on the house, still has some work to be done. And I think the week after Richelieu's foundation actually purchased the house, the ceiling in the solarium collapsed, and the balustrades around the portico came down. So those things are being repaired. And once that work is finished, then it will be a convening place for the New Voices Fund. The village of Irvington is not really keen on creating a new house museum. And Lyndhurst, as you may know, is really struggling. I mean, house museums, this one must have an endowment, so it's surviving. But it's really hard to make a house museum survive. But I know Richelieu's. Jack and Jad, hey, how are you?
How did Madam Walker educate herself, given the circumstances in which she grew up?
That's a really great question. So, born on a plantation, and she would later say that she got some rudimentary education in her church, this black minister who was a state senator. So it was pretty rudimentary. And then the horrible, cruel brother-in-law wasn't going to let her go to school even if there had been schools. But once she got to St. Louis, these women of the church who were really dedicated made sure that her daughter was going to kindergarten, and so she was going to school, so she was starting to learn some things along with her daughter. And there were, in this first generation out of slavery, there were night schools, and people were, she was going to night schools, but it was really, really rudimentary. And then once she became successful, she surrounded herself with people who could tutor her. So the woman she hired to manage the employees in the factory was a former dean of girls at a black boarding school in Kentucky, a woman named Alice Kelly, who often traveled with her. So she was improving her grammar. And there's a letter that her attorney wrote to her, and he said, the next time you're in Indianapolis, we need to go to the bank to sign a new signature card because your handwriting has improved so much. And her secretary, who was, had started working in 1914, who was still working for her when I was growing up, and who was my neighbor, Violet Reynolds, was one of my main sources of information. And she said that whenever Madam Walker was in the city, that the office girls were also excited to spend time with her. So they would read the newspaper together. And if somebody didn't understand a word, they would all look it up. So she was really about lifelong learning, but she was a self-taught and tutored person. But that's a good question.
I have a question about the house and its furnishings, and if the support, it's specifically choosing like the first African American licensed architect for the objects and the furniture in the house, does she also gravitate towards supporting Black craftsmen, perhaps?
That's a really great question. So, as an African American woman with an African American architect, did she gravitate towards Black craftsmen? It's a really good question, and the answer, as far as I can tell, is there weren't that many that she was, who she was buying things from. So it was a kind of an interesting, excuse me, an interesting dichotomy, where this aspiration to make a statement about, we can do whatever you can do, that a lot of the furnishings and a lot of the art was very European. So you couldn't see it in the, see if I can go back, like in, so this is these sort of painted scenes, yeah, these are European scenes. And in the dining room, the same kind of thing. So it is right, the aspiration is to what is the standard in America.
I have a funny anecdote for you. Enrico Caruso's collection goes for sale in the 1920s, and you can find in St. Louis Art Museum objects from European objects from Enrico Caruso's collection. So I was curious. I was just like, maybe they bought from, the daughter bought from that.
Well, that's interesting. So for the people in the other room, so Enrico Caruso's collection went on auction in the 1920s, and some of it is in St. Louis in a museum there. So I'm not aware of that, but that's an interest. There's an inventory. Again, from a family of pack rats, I actually have the bill of sale for a lot of the furniture, from the piano, from all of those things, and so I can see what they bought. And then in 1931, after the market crashed, and Madam Walker had said in her will that the house should go to the NAACP, but the taxes were too expensive, and so they ended up selling the house to the Companions of the Forest. But there is also an auction booklet that lists a lot of the items in the house. Yes.
Are there any stories? I'm sure there's lots of stories, but of significant sabotage to her business pursuits or her pursuits in general from within her own community or from outside in the white community? And how did she transcend those?
That's good. So the question is, was there sabotage from her, from within her own community or outside her community to her business? So there are a couple of examples that when she, during World War I, when she was really paying attention and being quite outspoken about lynching and about the rights of African American soldiers, she was spied upon by a black spy in the War Department who was sort of finding out if any black people were socialists or radicals. And she hosted a meeting with Marcus Garvey and some other people. They called themselves the International League of Darker Peoples. And this black spy, because they wanted to go to, observe the peace talks at Versailles. And this black spy wrote up a report, which I have found in the State Department records, that called them Negro subversives. Oh. And which of course I loved, because it was like being a Nixon enemy. So that was like, I was like, yes, Madam Walker, a Negro subversive. But her attorney, Mr. Ransom, who was, very conservative, very straight of the line, had said to her, after talking to Emmett Scott, I think you will be, as he said, circumscribed, because these other people don't have anything to lose, and you have a big business, and they will come after you, and the government will be able to shut you down. But in fact, what ended up happening is that the State Department denied her a passport to go to France. But they were sort of doing that for any African Americans who they thought were going to bring up the race issue in Paris. So yes, so in that way she was definitely attacked. So excellent question. I'm going to do here and then there. Yes.
Well, based on how Booker T. Washington treated her, at least for the first part of that story, how difficult was it within her own community for men to agree that a woman had become maybe more successful than most of them, and how did it affect the marriages of all those women who were doing so well with a husband who maybe wasn't doing so well? Was there tension just because of the goal of succeeding?
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely the case. So interestingly, Booker T. Washington's, third wife, I think his first wife died, maybe two wives died, the mothers of his children, but his third wife was a woman with no children, Margaret Murray Washington, who was Dean of Girls at Tuskegee and who was very outspoken, who was president of the National Association of Colored Women. So he knew how to, interact with a woman who had some power and some ability to be in charge and who was a leader. But I think in general there was a lot of resentment. But a lot of the women who were leaders in the club movement were graduate, not a lot, but some of them were graduates of Oberlin, some of them had studied abroad, many of them were single women. So there were women who were in charge. But yes, it's the same tension. This is the Netflix series, which if you see it, it's March 20th. It is Hollywood. But the writers of the script have kind of gone in on the, women threatening men. But I think in Madam Walker's case, it was the first husband died. Her second husband, this was when she was still really poor. He just, was kind of a ne'er-do-well. And I think with C.J. Walker, it was good in the beginning because they were doing this business together. But as she began to become more successful, he wasn't really keeping up. And she told a reporter some years later, when we began to make $10 a week, my husband thought that was enough. And due to his narrowness of vision, we parted ways. But what she didn't say is that he was having an affair with one of her agents. So, so that, just it kind of, what a cliche. And I saw, yes. Forever. But interestingly, we actually did not sit around the dining room table talking about Madam Walker, but there were things that sort of were in the ether. The silverware that we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram, and there was linen that we never used, but that had the monogram. The baby grand piano in our living room had belonged to Lelia Walker that I learned to read music on. Our china had been Madam Walker's china that had been at Villa Lewaro. But my mother had grown up with a lot of pressure. She was the fourth generation of women in her family to be an executive at the Walker Company, which was, by the time I was growing up, was declining. It was no longer a major player, but she went to Howard and she majored in chemistry and business because she knew she was supposed to work in the family business. But she did not pressure us, and I think she knew that we needed to, my two brothers and me needed to find our own path. And I just remember being in a cab in D.C. I wasn't living in D.C., but wherever I was living, I was going to the airport, and the cab driver, and I started talking, and he said he had gone to Howard. And I said, oh, my mother went to Howard. And he said, well, when was she there? And, what was her name? And I said, Lelia Perry. He said, oh, we used to see her walk across campus in her raccoon coat and say, money, money, money. So I know that she did not want us to be put in that box. But she went to work at the Walker Company every day. So I saw her working, and I would go to her office and play on her adding machine and typewriter before calculators and computers. But she really encouraged me to do my thing. And Jackie, my former colleague at ABC, my thing was writing. And so that's what I ended up doing. And then when I got to sort of finally answer your question, when did I get to this? I wrote a paper in high school about Lelia Walker because she knew the writers and artists that I was interested in the late 1960s, when, you know, Black Power, Black cultural stuff was going on, and I was more interested in her. Madam Walker was complicated. It was about hair, and, you know, I wasn't quite ready to deal with it. But when I got to Columbia in journalism school, my advisor was a woman named Phyllis Garland, who was the only Black woman on the faculty. Phil had worked at Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been an editor at the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a Black weekly newspaper, which was a very powerful newspaper. And when Phil and I met to talk about what I was going to write my master's paper on, I gave her some very cliched topics, like, I don't know, Fulton Fish Market, or, you know, something really, those of you who are from New York know I'm like, what? And at the end of the conversation, Phil said to me, "Your name is Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and Lelia Walker?" And I, you know, I'm sure Phil knew the answer to this, but I was not walking around going, "Oh, you know, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." And that was 1975, and there were not a lot of people saying, you know, you need to write a book about Black women. Alex Haley's Roots came out around that time, and I'm old enough to remember that there would be an Alice Walker book, and maybe 18 months later a Toni Morrison book, and, you know, 6 months later a Nikki Giovanni book, but there were not tons of books and, you know, things being published. But that really set me on the path to where I am now. Hence the Netflix series. Thank you. So I think we're going to go sign some books.
Did she ever meet her white competitors, like art or?
I don't think she did, but that would be an interesting play.
I enjoyed hearing the story about like the first female Black because
Let me get my bag so I can get my car. Sorry. And I like talking with groups of women entrepreneurs.
and we like mutually friendly agency. This is my secret. We advocate for female and we need to figure out how to
With their marrow.